The espresso machine at the morning anchor had been hissing like something wounded since 6 in the morning, and nobody had fixed it because nobody had time. I was Amara Bennett, 26 years old, South Los Angeles born and raised, and currently running on 4 hours of sleep and the specific kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones when you've been strong for too long. My mother's latest oncology statement from Cedars-Sinai was folded in the back pocket of my jeans. $90,000. I hadn't thrown it away because throwing it away didn't make it disappear. I had learned that the hard way. The morning anchor sat on the corner of Crenshaw Boulevard. Not fancy, not failing, just alive in the stubborn, quiet way that things survive in South LA when nobody is paying attention to them. I liked that about it. I understood it. I was wiping down the counter, my thick curls pinned up in a knot that had stopped being neat 2 hours ago, when Monica Hayes called from the back room with the energy of a woman who had seen everything twice. "Amara, if that grinder starts screaming again, I'm leaving it on the curb and telling the health inspector it was already there." "Noted," I called back. The bell above the door rang. "Last call for sit down in about 10, I said without looking up. "But I can get you something to go." Silence. Not the comfortable kind, but the kind that has weight. I looked up. He was standing just inside the door, a boy no older than 6, and everything about him was a contradiction that didn't make sense until it did. His school uniform was charcoal gray with a gold crest stitched above the left breast pocket, the kind of blazer that cost more per term than I made in 3 months. His shoes were polished mirror bright. His black hair was neatly combed with the precision of someone who had done it for him that morning. Every visible thing about him said money, security, and untouchability. His eyes said something entirely different. They were wide, dark, and full of a fear that had no business living in a 6-year-old's face. The particular fear of a child who has been frightened for so long he no longer knows what it feels like not to be. He glanced over his shoulder at the window once, quickly, the way someone checks for a tail. Then he turned back to me, reaching into the inside pocket of his blazer with both hands. Careful, deliberate, the hands of a child who had rehearsed this, and produced a folded bill. It was $100. Pressed flat and slightly damp at the edges, like he'd been holding it in his fist for blocks. He placed it on the glass counter and slid it toward me. And then, in a voice so quiet I felt it more than heard it, he asked me the question that rerouted my entire life. "Can you act like my mother? Just for today. I want to tell you I thought it through. I want to tell you I weighed the options, considered the risks, and arrived at a reasonable, measured response. The truth is simpler and less logical than that." I looked at those eyes, and everything in me that had ever protected anyone, ever stood between something small and something dangerous, moved before my brain caught up. I came around the counter and crouched down to his level. I looked at him the way I wished someone had looked at me during my hardest years. Steady, present, and unafraid. "What's your name, sweetheart?" He swallowed. "Ethan." He hadn't spoken to a stranger in 2 years, but he was speaking to me. I stood up, untied my apron, and pulled my trench coat from the hook by the register. I took his hand in both of mine. It was ice-cold and small, and it gripped back immediately, the way a drowning person grips a rope. "Monica," I called toward the back. "Taking my lunch. Might run long." I didn't wait for the answer, just pushed through the glass door and out into the gray Tuesday morning with a child I'd known for 40 seconds and a feeling I couldn't name yet. Something between instinct and inevitability. "Keep your 100, Ethan," I told him as we walked. "I charge in smiles." I didn't know his last name then. I didn't know his father's name. I didn't know that the iron gates of Blackwell Academy were 3 blocks from the beginning of the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to me. I just knew the boy beside me exhaled slowly and carefully, for what sounded like the first time all morning. And I thought, That's enough reason. It always is. His full name was Ethan Kong, and he told me like he was confessing something. The words came out in careful, measured pieces, not the way children usually talk, tumbling over themselves to be heard, but slowly, deliberately, the way someone speaks when they have learned that silence is safer than sound. He told me there was a family day at Blackwell Academy and that it started at 11. Every other child would have a mother standing beside them at the craft tables and the food tents, and he would be the only one who didn't. He said this last part without self-pity, which was somehow the most heartbreaking version of it. "My father's men follow me," he said, gazing once toward the window. "Everywhere. But I slipped out during the car switch this morning. They don't know yet." I looked at this child, 6 years old, blazer pressed to a knife's edge, shoes polished bright enough to reflect the café ceiling, and I understood something without needing it explained. This was not a boy who had been neglected in the ordinary sense. He had been given everything that money could itemize and nothing that it couldn't. He had grown up inside luxury the way some children grow up inside loneliness, entirely without realizing there was another option. The careful way he had folded that $100 bill, the rehearsed precision of the ask. This was a child who had learned to negotiate with adults because adults were the only company he'd ever been offered. "Monica," I called toward the back. Pause followed. "If you're asking me to fix that grinder, I'm taking my lunch. Might run a little long." The sound Monica made suggested she had thoughts about this. I pulled my trench coat from the hook, picked up my bag, and didn't wait to hear them. Outside, the morning was the color of unpolished pewter, overcast and cool, the kind of Tuesday that doesn't commit to anything. Ethan walked beside me on the pavement, his small shoes making precise, even sounds against the concrete. I matched my pace to his without thinking about it. "What do you like to eat?" I asked, not because it mattered strategically but just because he was 6. Nobody had asked him anything simple in a while, and I could tell. He considered this seriously, the way he seemed to consider everything. "Chocolate," he said at last. "And rice." "Not together." "Obviously not together," I said. "I like chocolate too. Dark though. None of that waxy stuff." He looked up at me with the cautious interest of someone testing whether warmth is real or performed. "My dad doesn't keep chocolate in the house." "Well," I said, "that's a problem we can solve." Something shifted in his posture then, almost imperceptible, just a fraction of an inch closer to my side. His small shoulder grazing my arm. He didn't say anything else for the rest of the walk. Neither did I. We just moved through the gray morning together, past a dry cleaner's, past a woman walking 2 small dogs, and past a mural of a woman with her arms spread wide above the words, "You are still here." The iron gates of Blackwell Academy materialized at the end of the block. Tall, black, ornate, the kind of gates that exist to remind people on the outside exactly where they stand. Ethan's hand found mine. By the time we pushed through them, he was half a step closer to me than when we'd started. I pretended not to notice. He pretended not to notice that I noticed. We were already good at taking care of each other. Blackwell Academy's lawn looked like a catalog for a life I had never been invited to browse. There were catered tents with linen tablecloths and flower arrangements that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Women in structured blazers and heeled boots moved through the grass without seeming to touch it, laughing the specific laugh of people who have never once had to calculate whether they could afford to laugh. Their children ran between the tents in coordinated outfits, clean, unhurried, and completely unafraid. I felt the stares the moment we stepped through the gate. It built gradually, the way pressure builds, one pair of eyes becoming 2, becoming a dozen. A black woman in a worn trench coat and scuffed combat boots, her hair escaping its bun in 3 directions, holding the hand of one of the most expensively dressed children on the lawn. I kept my face easy and my spine straight, walking like I had been there 100 times, because the only thing worse than not belonging somewhere is letting it show. Ethan stayed close. We found the craft table and painted ceramic mugs, His was a dragon, mine was supposed to be a sun but looked more like an aggressive flower, and for 20 minutes, the lawn was just a lawn and we were just two people making ugly art together. Then Vanessa Whitmore arrived. I heard her before I fully saw her. A voice with the particular carrying quality of someone accustomed to being listened to. She was somewhere in her early 30s, blonde hair set in perfect waves, diamonds at her ears. Her son trailing behind her with the bored expression of a child who had learned to mirror his mother's disdain. She looked at me the way people look at something they are deciding whether to touch. "Ethan," she said warmly to him. Then to me, with a smile that was entirely architectural. "And you must be his caretaker." It wasn't a question. It was a classification. Ethan went still beside me. I felt him shift his weight backward, his shoulder pressing into my arm, making himself smaller in the practiced way of a child who has learned that shrinking prevents conflict. The movement went through me like a current. I smiled wide, genuine, all teeth. "I'm Amara," I said pleasantly. "His mother. For today, and however many days after that he'll have me." I tilted my head. "I didn't catch your name." Vanessa blinked. "Vanessa Whitmore." I was simply. "It was so lovely to meet you, Vanessa," I said, already turning back to the craft table, my hand finding Ethan's shoulder. "Enjoy the rest of your afternoon." The silence behind me was the most satisfying sound I had heard all week. I heard her heels on the grass, one beat, two, and then nothing, which meant she had walked away. We had won something that didn't have a name but mattered anyway. I looked down at Ethan. He was staring up at me, his dark eyes enormous and completely unguarded. All the careful control he wore like a second uniform had dissolved entirely. He looked like a child who had just watched someone perform a miracle and was still deciding whether he'd actually seen it. "She called me a caretaker," I said, picking up my paintbrush. "The audacity." A sound came out of Ethan then. Small, startled, real. Laugh. His first since the café. It lit his whole face up like something coming back on after a long power cut. I kept painting my aggressive flower and said nothing, because some moments are too good to talk over. We were at the food tent 40 minutes later, debating the structural integrity of a miniature quiche, when the air changed. It didn't shift gradually. It didn't cool or thicken by degrees. Simply stopped. The laughter on the lawn cut off mid-note, the way a song stops when someone pulls the power. I looked up from the quiche. 3 matte black Cadillac Escalades had pushed through the school's vehicle barriers at the far end of the lawn. They didn't park. They halted, the way things halt when parking is not a consideration. They sat diagonally on the manicured grass, engines still running, and then all 6 doors opened at once. The men who stepped out were dressed in tailored black suits, and they moved across the lawn the way water moves into a space. Quiet, efficient, total. Their hands stayed near their jackets. The PTA mothers nearest the gate grabbed their children in one smooth motion, backing away with the specific instinct of people who recognize danger even when they can't name it. Someone knocked over a floral centerpiece, but nobody stopped to pick it up. Ethan made a sound I hadn't heard from him before. It was small and involuntary, barely a sound at all, more like the shape of one, and it came from somewhere much younger and much more frightened than the composed little boy who had walked into my café that morning. He turned into me, pressing his face against my stomach, his fingers curling into the fabric of my coat with a grip that had nothing rehearsed about it. I put both arms around him and held on. From the center Escalade the last door opened. The man who stepped out didn't hurry. He didn't scan the crowd or check his surroundings or do any of the things that people in dangerous situations do. He simply stood there for a moment, and the lawn reorganized itself around him the way space reorganizes around something with mass. He was tall, with a kind of face that would have been beautiful if it had ever been asked to be. A sharp jaw, dark eyes, and black hair pushed back with the casual precision of a man whose appearance was the least of his weapons. He wore a suit that fit like a conviction. He looked like someone had taken the concept of authority and given it cheekbones. He wasn't looking at the socialites, the bodyguards, or the chaos of overturned centerpieces. He was looking at his son, Ethan. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who did not need volume because volume was for people who doubted they would be obeyed. "Come here." Ethan's grip on my coat tightened. "No," he said. It was barely louder than a breath, but it landed on that lawn like something thrown hard at something solid. Adrian Kong. I did not know his name yet, but I knew what he was the way you know a weather system before it arrives. Went very, very still. The men around him went still with him, a synchronized pause, as though stillness were contagious. I held Ethan against me, looked at the man across the lawn, and felt my heartbeat in places I didn't usually feel it. I did not let go. The inside of the Escalades smelled like leather, money, and something colder underneath both. I was in the back seat before I had fully decided to get in, not forced exactly, but moved by the particular gravity of a situation that has already made the decision for you. Ethan had been gently but firmly transferred to the first vehicle by the man they called Marcus, a wall of quiet muscle with careful eyes who handled the boy with a gentleness that surprised me. Ethan had cried my name twice as the door closed, a sound that lived in my sternum like a splinter. Adrian Kong sat across from me. He hadn't looked at me since we got in the car. He was looking out the tinted window at the passing city with the focused distance of someone reviewing something internal, and I had the distinct impression that whatever calculation he was running, it was almost finished. On the console between us sat a tablet, its screen lit and facing me. It displayed my name, my address on Crenshaw, the name of the café, and Monica's name listed as my employer. And at the bottom, in clean digital numerals, was the balance of my mother's oncology account at Cedars-Sinai. $90,412. "We've been in this car 4 minutes, I said. 3, Adrian corrected, without looking away from the window. I folded my hands in my lap to keep them still. My pulse was doing something complicated, but I refused to let it reach my face. I had grown up in a neighborhood where showing fear was an invitation, and some lessons don't leave you just because the setting changes. "My son hasn't spoken to a stranger in 2 years, Adrian said, finally turning to look at me. Up close, his eyes were darker than I'd expected. Not cold exactly, but stripped of anything unnecessary. "He chose you in under an hour. I want to know why." "I listened to him," I said. "That's usually enough." Something moved behind his eyes. He reached into his jacket and produced a slim, black, embossed checkbook, then clicked a pen. He wrote a number and tore the check free with the efficiency of a man for whom this gesture was routine. He held it out. 90,000. "Tonight. Your mother's debt is cleared by morning." He set the check on the console between us. "In exchange, you will move into the Kong estate. You will be a consistent, stable presence for my son. Not a nanny. Not an employee. You will be what he asked you for today." I looked at the check. The numbers blurred and then sharpened. "And if I say no? Then life becomes more complicated than it needs to be." He said it the way someone states a weather forecast. Matter of fact, unfortunate, but not personal. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I picked up the check, folded it once, and held it in my hand rather than putting it away. "I want a room with a lock," I said. "My own key. I don't take direction from Marcus or anyone else wearing a suit in that house. I answer to Ethan and only Ethan. And I come and go as I choose." Adrian studied me. Across the length of the back seat, in the gray afternoon light filtering through tinted glass, I watched something move across his face that he did not quite manage to keep still. "Done," he said. Then, almost to himself, quieter. "Welcome to the Kong household, Ms. Bennett." The convoy turned north toward the Hollywood Hills. I kept the check in my hand and thought about my mother's face, refusing to allow myself to think about anything else just yet. The Kong estate sat above the city like something that had decided the city was beneath it. Made of glass, black marble, and clean geometric angles cantilevered over the edge of Mulholland Drive, it was the kind of architecture that isn't built to feel like a home, but to feel like a statement. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of my suite, I could see Los Angeles spread out in every direction, millions of lights arranged like a conversation the city was having with itself. It was beautiful, yet completely indifferent to whether I was watching. I had never felt further from Crenshaw Boulevard. But Ethan was there, and Ethan was the reason I was there. So, I unpacked my 2 bags into a closet the size of my old apartment, turned the key in the lock twice just to confirm it worked, and went to find him. We built things like a city out of Lego that took up most of the sitting room floor, complete with roads, a harbor, and an airport that Ethan redesigned 3 times because the runway wasn't long enough. We baked cookies that spread into one enormous, misshapen disc and ate them anyway, standing over the counter as both of us pronounced them excellent. We read through the library's children's section systematically, tackling 1 book per night, sometimes 2 if Ethan wasn't tired. When we ran out, we started on the ones that weren't technically for children, which turned out to be fine because Ethan was not technically like other children. 3 weeks, that was all it took. The hollow, careful boy who had slid a $100 bill across my café counter with practiced adult precision was gone. In his place was a child who came running when he heard my footsteps in the hall, who laughed at my terrible jokes with his whole body, head thrown back, completely undignified. He said my name, Amara, with a warmth that had been quietly escalating in weight and meaning until I had stopped being able to file it away as simply professional. I did not examine that feeling too closely. I just kept showing up. Adrian was something I heard more than saw. Doors closing at midnight, low voices in Korean carrying through the walls of the study. Controlled, terse, the cadence of men managing something that did not want to be managed. Sometimes I passed him in the hallway and he would give me a brief nod, assessing and neutral, before continuing on his way. Sometimes I looked up from the kitchen island at 2 in the morning while getting water and found him at the far end of the room, standing at the window with a glass of something amber, watching the city. He never acknowledged those moments, and neither did I. I understood none of the words spoken through the study walls, but I understood all of the weight behind them. Marcus Reed, for his part, had settled into a watchful neutrality toward me that I suspected was the closest thing to approval he offered anyone. He appeared when Ethan needed redirecting and disappeared when he didn't, moving through the house with the silent efficiency of someone who had learned to be useful without being present. Once, I found him teaching Ethan how to fold a piece of paper into a crane with the focused patience of a man who had nowhere else to be. He saw me watching and said nothing. I said nothing back. We understood each other. The estate was beautiful, suffocating, and, for now, the only world that mattered. Inside it, something small and previously broken was choosing daily, stubbornly, and with increasing confidence to be whole. That was enough. Had to be. It was a Tuesday evening and the library was warm. Ethan was working through a phonics worksheet with a concentrated frown of someone defusing something delicate. I was cross-legged on the opposite end of the rug, ostensibly reading but mostly watching him sound out syllables under his breath with the private intensity of a child who refuses to be wrong. The lamp on the side table threw everything into gold. The house was quiet in the way it rarely was. Genuinely quiet, not just waiting. The double doors opened. Adrian walked in with the automatic authority of a man entering his own space. His jacket was off and his tie was pulled loose. He hadn't seen us yet. His head was down, and one hand was pressed to his temple in a gesture I had not seen from him before, letting something private and fatigued leak through. His shirt was white, or had been. There was something dark on the collar and on the cuff of his right sleeve. The unmistakable rust-edged color of dried blood. Ethan looked up. Marcus, my voice was level. Ethan needs his warm milk. Marcus materialized from the hallway. He was always somewhere nearby, I had learned, and ushered Ethan out with a gentleness so practiced it was clearly not the first time he'd been asked to clear a room. Ethan went without protest, though he looked back once, his eyes moving between me and his father with an intelligence too acute for a 6-year-old. The doors clicked shut. Adrian had gone still the moment I spoke. He was looking at me now across the library with the flat, unreadable expression of a man recalibrating. "You have blood on your collar," I said. "An occupational hazard." "Don't." I stood up. "Don't do that with me. I'm not your men. I don't need the performance." Something tightened in his jaw. He moved toward me, not aggressively, but with the weight of someone accustomed to forward motion resolving situations. I did not step back, which seemed to surprise him. He stopped with 3 feet between us, close enough that I could see the exhaustion he kept architecturally concealed in every other context. I told him what I had been watching for 3 weeks, Ethan flinching at the sound of the study doors, the nightmares I heard through the walls, and the way the boy braced his small shoulders whenever someone raised their voice, making himself compact and ready for something that never quite arrived but felt like it always might. "You think you're protecting him," I said. "You're not. You're teaching him that this is what love looks like. Locked rooms, armed men, and a father who comes home with blood on his shirt and expects everyone to pretend they don't see it." Adrian's voice was very quiet. "Be careful, Ms. Bennett. You hired me to be present with your son. This is me being present." I held his gaze. "I'm not afraid of you, Adrian. I think that confuses you, but I need you to hear this." For a long moment, neither of us moved. The lamp hummed. The city shimmered 30 stories below. Then something in him, in his posture, in the rigid line of his shoulders, gave way. It wasn't dramatic, just a single degree, the way a wall doesn't fall but suddenly develops a crack. He told me about Damien Cho, about what expansion meant in practical terms, and about what happened to the people Adrian valued if he was perceived as softening. I listened until he finished. Then I said, "You don't show them weakness. You show them something worse. You show them that you chose justice." He looked at me for a long time after that, not calculating, just looking. He didn't respond. He simply picked up his jacket from the chair and walked out, but he hadn't told me I was wrong. Something changed after the library incident. It wasn't announced. Adrian didn't arrive at breakfast one morning with an altered agenda and a revised personality. It was quieter than that. A slow, almost imperceptible shift in where he chose to be. He started appearing in rooms where Ethan and I already were. He wasn't inserting himself or performing presence, but just staying nearby. He would come into the kitchen while we were attempting dinner and sit at the far end of the island with a glass of water, watching Ethan try to crack an egg with the focused seriousness of a surgeon. He would appear in the doorway of the library while I was reading to Ethan before bed, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, listening to a chapter about a boy who befriends a dragon without knowing it. He never came in and he never asked to join. He just stood there in the doorway until the chapter was done, and then he was gone. I didn't comment on it. Ethan noticed, though. He began performing slightly for these appearances, reading more dramatically, constructing more elaborate Lego structures, and asking me louder questions that were really, I understood, invitations. "Watch me. See me." Adrian stayed a little longer each time. At odd hours, I would come down to the kitchen for water and find him already at the island. No jacket, no watch, just a glass of whiskey and the particular silence of a man with too much to think about. He didn't send me away, and I didn't manufacture conversation. I made tea and sat at my end of the island, and we coexisted in the dark like two people who had developed an understanding that neither of them had formally agreed to. Once he said, "He laughed today. I heard it from the study." "He laughs every day now," I replied. He turned the whiskey glass in his hands. "I know." He left before I could say anything else. Meanwhile, the house was doing something it tried not to show me. Marcus's security checks went from twice daily to every 4 hours, and the guard rotation tightened. I noticed new faces in the exterior camera feeds. Different men, shorter shifts, with no one staying long enough to establish a pattern. I noticed the way Marcus scanned exits before he entered rooms, a habit so ingrained it was probably unconscious. I said nothing, but I started learning the house the way I had learned every difficult environment I had ever survived. Quietly, thoroughly, and without broadcasting what I was doing. I noted where the exits were, which hallways connected to which, how many steps lay between my room and Ethan's, and how quickly I could cover that distance in the dark. The estate remained beautiful, the evenings remained warm, and Ethan remained radiant with the specific joy of a child who has recently discovered he is loved and cannot stop touching the knowledge of it. But the calm had a texture I recognized. I had felt it before in the hour before things became irreversible. I memorized the floor plan, said my prayers, and kept my boots by the bed. The security system went dark at 9:47 on a Thursday. There was no alarm and no emergency alert on the panel by the kitchen door. Instead, a sudden silence arrived in place of the quiet hum I had stopped consciously hearing weeks ago. The sound of the system running, of the cameras cycling, of the house watching its own perimeter. When it stopped, the absence was so complete it woke something animal in me before my brain caught up. I was at the stove warming Ethan's milk, and the small saucepan was just beginning to steam. Then, the terrace glass detonated inward. 3 men in dark clothes and masks came through the opening in a practice sequence. 1, 2, 3, before the first piece of glass had finished falling. I didn't think. I grabbed the cast iron skillet off the back burner with both hands and swung it at the nearest figure. I felt the impact travel up my arms, heard a crack and a grunt, and dropped behind the marble island as the kitchen above me came apart in a sudden, deafening percussion. Cabinet doors, the tile backsplash, and the overhead pendant light all shattered, swinging and taking the room into darkness and emergency lighting. Find the kid. Get the woman. The voice was calm, amused, and without hurry, making it the most frightening thing I had heard in my life. Damien Cho walked through the destroyed terrace door with his silver-plated gun at his side, and a smile designed specifically to communicate that he had done this before. He was lean and sharply dressed, moving like a man arriving at something he had been looking forward to. But I was already gone. I slipped through the pantry door, into the service corridor, pressing flat against the wall and moving without light by the map I had memorized. Left at the junction, 8 steps to the secondary stair. Up, right, and 14 steps to Ethan's door. I went through it without knocking. He was under the bed with his hands clamped over his ears and his knees pulled to his chest, trembling with the whole-body terror of a child absorbing something far too large for him. I was on the floor and underneath with him in 4 seconds, pulling him against me with his face in my hands. "It's me," I breathed. "It's Amara. Look at me. I've got you. Nobody is getting to you." His eyes found mine in the dark and held. Footsteps sounded in the hallway, getting closer and louder. I wrapped my whole body around him, pressed my back against the bed frame, and didn't move or breathe. I meant every word I had just said with a ferocity that had nothing metaphorical about it. The footsteps reached the door. Then, the front of the house detonated. It wasn't a knock or a simple breach. The doors came off their hinges in a single concussive moment that shook the floor beneath us. The hallway outside filled with sharp white light, the sweeping beams of tactical vehicles, along with loud, procedural voices carrying the specific authority of people with federal credentials and documented cause. FBI. Down, down. Hands where I can see them. Ethan buried his face in my chest, and I held the back of his head. "It's okay," I whispered. "It's over." I wasn't sure yet if I believed it, but he needed to, so I said it like I did. Chapter 9. Karma has good aim. He hadn't come back with syndicate muscle. When I crawled out from under Ethan's bed with the boy in my arms, The hallway was full of federal light and the sounds of men being forcibly redirected toward the floor. Adrian Kong was already at the bedroom door. He wasn't in a suit, and he wore no leather gloves, no controlled expression, and no architectural composure. He was just a man in a dark jacket, breathing hard, who had clearly run from wherever he'd been the moment he got the call. He dropped to his knees on the floor of his son's bedroom and reached for both of us. There was no management or calibration. He simply threw his arms around Ethan and me with a tightness that communicated everything he did not have words for yet. The terror of the last hour, the accumulated cost of the last several years, and the particular grief of a man who has spent so long building walls that he forgot to check whether the people he loved were inside them or out. Ethan gripped his father's jacket with both fists and said nothing. Neither did I. Some moments don't require language. In the hallway, Marcus Reed was guiding federal agents through the house with the focused efficiency of someone who had been cooperating with this plan for longer than tonight. Damien Cho was on the floor near the front entry, his wrists bound, his silver gun confiscated, and an articulate but wordless fury written on his face. The estate filled with red and blue lights that moved across the marble walls like something being slowly dismantled. "You told me to show them justice," Adrian said, his voice rough and stripped of everything decorative. He was speaking against my hair, the way a person speaks when they need the words to land somewhere close. I finally listened. He had spent the previous week in quiet, careful motion, transferring files, ledgers, offshore account structures, and the documented names of 17 public officials from his private servers to a federal prosecutor he had contacted through a channel that did not connect back to the estate. He had handed over the very architecture of his own empire, every pier, every shell company, and every arrangement that had kept the syndicate invisible for a decade. Damien's planned expansion, the rebel faction's funding sources, all of it was documented and delivered in exchange for immunity, federal protection, and the clean slate Amara had told him to earn. It was the most dangerous thing he had ever done, and it cost him everything he had built. He did it anyway. 2 months later, we were at a modest beachfront house in Malibu. It wasn't a fortress or a statement, just a house with salt-weathered wood, wide windows, and the sound of the ocean in every room. Ethan was on the beach with a golden retriever puppy we had adopted the week prior. A ridiculous, enthusiastic animal named Biscuit who had already eaten one of my socks and showed no remorse. Ethan was chasing him through the surf, laughing with the full, unguarded abandon of a child who has remembered that the world is allowed to be fun. The sound carried up to the porch and sat there like something warm. My mother was in a chair beside the door, wrapped in a blanket, with a cup of tea balanced on the armrest. Her oncologist had used the word remission 2 weeks ago in a tone that suggested he was genuinely pleased. She had cried and I had cried, and then she asked me to stop crying because it was making her cry harder and nobody had time for that. She was watching Ethan and the dog with the expression of a woman who has lived long enough to recognize a gift. I felt Adrian's arms come around my waist from behind, and he rested his chin on my shoulder. He wore a white linen shirt, no jacket, no watch, and had bare feet on the weathered porch boards, the version of him that was slowly becoming the most real. "He looks happy," Adrian said. "He is," I said. "We all are." He was quiet for a moment. Then he released me, stepped around to face me, and reached into the pocket of his shirt. He produced a folded bill, slightly crumpled and worn at the creases, the $100 that had traveled from a small boy's blazer pocket to a café counter to wherever Adrian had been keeping it ever since. He set it in my open palm. Then he lowered himself to one knee in the sand. He looked up at me with dark eyes that had no performance left in them, just a man kneeling in ordinary light, asking an enormous question in the simplest possible way. He opened a velvet box, and the diamond caught the afternoon sun, scattering its light. "He bought you for a day," Adrian said, his voice low, unhurried, and completely honest. I'm asking if you'll let me spend the rest of mine earning what he paid for. I looked at him, at the man who had dismantled his own dark world and walked out of the wreckage carrying only what mattered. I looked at the boy on the beach, laughing and free. I looked at my mother in her chair, alive and watching the water. I closed my fingers around the old bill. Then, I took his face in my other hand and pulled him to his feet. You had me at the locked room, I whispered and pressed my lips to his. Down on the beach, Ethan shrieked with delight as Biscuit stole his shoe and bolted for the water. My mother laughed. The ocean did what oceans do. Indifferent, enormous, and carrying everything forward regardless. Sometimes the universe doesn't send you a clear path or a reasonable plan. Sometimes it sends a small, frightened boy into a café on a gray Tuesday morning with $100 and an impossible request, asking you to say yes before you understand what you're saying yes to. Said yes. And everything that was broken, slowly and in its own time, came home.